Good evening, everyone. I'm Jed Atkins. I'm the Dean and Director of the School of Civic Life and Leadership here at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. At SKILL, that's the acronym for the school, at SKILL we seek to educate citizens who have the courage and judgment to be leaders who speak across difference. And that commitment finds one of its clearest expressions in the Abbey Speaker Series. The Abbey Speaker Series is hosted by our program for public discourse, which seeks to build our students' capacities for debate and deliberation, and to foster a culture of constructive dialogue about issues of national importance here at Carolina and beyond. 4 times each year, the Abbey Speaker Series brings together experts from different fields and disciplines to showcase productive dialogue on timely issues across a range of perspectives. On behalf of the university, I thank the Abbey family for helping us bring such important programming to campus. This year marks the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, and it's also Black History Month, an especially meaningful time to reflect on the meaning of those famous words. All men are created equal. And to wrestle with the reality that these words were written by a slave owner. This evening's panel features 2 distinguished scholars of American history and intellectual thought. I'm honored to introduce you to them, and I look forward to learning from them. Annette Gordon-Reed is the Carl M. Loeb University professor at Harvard. She's won 16 book prizes, including the Pulitzer Prize in History and the National Book Award for The Hemmingses of Monticello, an American family. The book tells the story of Sally Hemings, an enslaved woman and her family, including her children, who were fathered by Thomas Jefferson. Lucas Morel is the John K. Boardman Jr. Professor of Politics at Washington Lee University. He's published numerous books, including Lincoln and Liberty, Wisdom for the Ages, and Lincoln's Sacred Effort, defining religion's role in American self-government. A former president of the Abraham Lincoln Institute, he currently serves on the U.S. Semi-Quincentennial Commission. Our moderator, Max Owre, is executive director of the Carolina Public Humanities and teaching assistant professor of history here at Carolina, where he teaches European, world, and colonial history. Before we begin, I've been asked to remind you that North Carolina law and university policies protects the rights of free speech and free expression, including the rights of tonight's speakers to speak and the rights of the audience to listen and engage without substantial disruption. Campus policies provide for disciplinary action against any student or employee who substantially disrupts tonight's scheduled events. Any person who disrupts this evening's event or interferes with the rights of those in attendance to see or hear the speakers will be asked to leave. Anyone who does not leave when asked to do so or does not put down signs which obstruct the audience view will be removed and subject to appropriate disciplinary action. I also want to remind the audience that the views expressed by the panelists do not necessarily reflect those of the university or sponsoring program, so please speak freely. And now I'm delighted to turn this conversation over to Max.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dean Atkins. Thank you to Nora Hannigan and the folks at the Program for Public Discourse and everyone who made tonight possible. We're here tonight to mark a milestone, of course, the 250th anniversary of American independence, by asking one of the hardest questions it raises. What is the place of race in the American story? I'm joined here by 2 scholars that I deeply admire, especially after doing some of the prep work for this program, learning so much more about your incredible work. Our speakers have been chosen because we feel there's a great potential tonight for us to define the parameters of a debate about the American past and its meaning that has been heavily politicized in recent years. And I want to stress that my role here is just to seed a conversation. We have not asked our guests to prepare any opening statements. I hope, however, that in our first few questions we might establish some of the parameters of our debate, and look for areas of convergence and difference that will help us understand your positions. I have prepared questions, but I've certainly urged our guests to feel free to respond, interject politely, and bring to the table anything that would help us understand their positions. A few pieces of housekeeping. I want to remind the audience that we'll reserve 30 minutes for questions at the end, and online participants can ask questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of their screen. We will try to answer as many questions as we can, but I know this topic resonates with so many of you, so we probably will not get to all of them, but I hope that those conversations will seed questions will seed conversations later for you. So let's get right to it. Let's start with the title of this event itself, Race and the American Founding. What does the word founding mean to you, and why does it matter how we define it? And I would we could play rocks, paper, scissors, but why don't we start from right to left?
Stage right, I take it.
There you go. Stage right.
I'm going to be a wise guy and quote a TV series that I actually don't watch very often, but I saw a clip on YouTube, as we all do. I don't know if you know this TV series called Parks and Recreation. There's this true red, white, and blue character guy named Ron Swanson who somehow finds himself in London, and he, of course, hates Europe. And so he says, history began on July 4th, 1776. Everything before was a mistake. And why do I say that in response to your question? This question of founding, of course, presumes that there was something else or nothing, and then you create something new. And fairly early in the American Revolution, they adopted a slogan, Novus Ordo Seclorum, a new order of the ages. And so they at least thought of themselves as introducing something new in the new world, not the Ancien regime, not the old world that either they or their forebears left. And so founding, for me, again, hyperbole, but a very monumental kernel of truth from our esteemed historian Ron Swanson, founding means building something different, new, and I would go as far as to say something better than what came before. The founders thought they were doing not just something different, but something better. And to circle back to the question of race and the founding, the only reason why that's even a question for us or a controversy is precisely because something happened at the American founding. The product of the American Revolution, in fact, even as it was happening, was putting race into relief in a way that would not otherwise have happened. So I'll just throw those terms out there for starters.
Great, thank you.
Well, I would agree with most of that. Founding, to me, suggests the beginning of something, the end of something in the beginning, the end of the American colonists' recognition of law under the British Empire. And the Declaration is in the foundational document of American law that says we're no longer going to subscribe to British law. They took some things from the law and left some things, but they were doing something new. And the newness was creating a country that had its own rules, creating a republic, leaving behind a monarchy as a system of government, the system of government that covered most of the world. That was the new thing. Part of the new thing that they were doing was to create a government that was, well, eventually, the revolution started the process, but eventually coming up with a system of government that was based upon the consent of the governed and not a monarchy, as I said before. So it is something that it's a break with the past, but it's the creation of a new world, a new sense of self, and a different understanding about, well, thinking about citizens as opposed to subjects. Different relationship between the individuals who lived here and the governance structure. Race comes into it because, as we know, many of the people who were in America at the time, in the American colonies, were enslaved and were outside of civic life. And so the question becomes, what do you do about those people? What do you do about people of color, African American people who were not enslaved? How did they fit into this world? So and Native Americans, indigenous people, how do they fit? And so what we've been on is a sort of a 250-year journey trying to figure out how do you work this thing in a society that is multicultural, multiracial, what has been from the very, very beginning, not a place that has 1,000 years worth of history, no set religion that everybody ascribes to, a very, very religiously diverse country. All of those questions about how do you forge a nation. A nation wasn't built at July 4th, 1776. That's taken a while. But the beginning of this process is the founding, and that's why we keep looking back to it. We're a relatively new country, young country, and we can remember who the people who were the founders. I mean, I was talking to a historian of South America, and he said that people who are historians of the Americas focus on founding much more so than the Europeans do, obviously, because, I mean, Alfred the Great, I mean, how do you go, far back do you go? Who's the founder of England? Because we're new, we still recognize these people. This is just a blink of the eye in terms of history. We think about this moment as something that has relevance to us today.
Any follow-ups at all? Okay, I'm ready to
We
move.
don't disagree on that, but go ahead.
All right.
Well,
Well,
more questions.
let's get to an area where we know if you two don't disagree about this, we know some people do. What is the importance of having a founding story, and what is the importance of having a national narrative to begin with for civic life? We have two high-profile frameworks for American history, the 1619 Project and what some would call the 1776 Framework, which have really dominated public debate in recent years. And without asking you to sort of endorse or dismiss either, where do these get it right? Where do they fall short? And is it important to have a national story?
Well, I think people need a national story. Everybody has a national story. Every country has a story about their exceptional nature and why they're exceptional. And I think we need it because we have to knit the community together. There's not a real basis for bringing people together unless they have some sense of something in common. We do it with our families. Obviously, you're born into a family, and you, from there, have a sense of a connection to these people, and then maybe the town, and maybe the neighborhood, the town, the state, or whatever. But then the more you go out, the less reason there is to have a connection. But if you have a national narrative that you can agree on, not everything, but some things that you say, this is who we are, I think it's easy to have people pull together when it's necessary. And it's a matter of, in some senses, of survival. In a world where people engage in war and aggression and so forth, you have to have a basis for people sticking together, I think. And so I think it does that. It tells people who they are and how they should work together.
Yeah, I think it's problematic to have multiple narratives about who we are. The great exhibit A in this, of course, is the Civil War. One might argue that the Civil War happened precisely because America was suffering a crisis of identity. And in the years leading up to the Civil War, especially that so pivotal decade of the 1850s, we really were becoming two countries. We really were beginning to differ in profound ways with regards to what we expected, in particular from our national constitution, the U.S. Constitution. It's so quick to pivot to the Southerners, they're rebels, they're fighting, as Lincoln put it, somehow everyone knew that slavery was the cause of the war, but we forget that Southerners had some fairly plausible, in some cases logical claims to justice that they thought would be denied by the incoming Republican administration, right? Lincoln was elected with less than 40% of the popular vote. He did receive a clear majority in the Electoral College, which, reminder, it's the only thing that matters under the Constitution is you get those votes. But clearly, Southerners said, look, under Dred Scott, we're allowed to take human beings and enslave them in federal territories, and the Republicans are on record as saying, we don't see that we're required to do that. In fact, we're going to pass a law to deny the enforcement of that. There would be no Republican Party, but for that plank that fused them as a coalition party when the Whig Party imploded, it was no slavery in the federal territories. Well, Taney 7-2 decision says, guess what? Back in 1820, Congress didn't have the right to ban slavery in the territories that produced the Missouri Compromise. That was after they said, oh, you know, black people, they weren't intended to and could not be citizens of this country. Notice, not slaves. It wasn't on the basis of their status legally as slaves, those who were enslaved. It was their race that Taney said disqualified them from becoming American citizens, from being American citizens. So for me, because we could not peacefully, which is to say we could not politically resolve our differences of opinion with regards to what am I owed under my Constitution, right? In other words, what is justice calling for in this instance when their guy, Breckinridge, didn't get elected, perhaps Stephen Douglas, when it was the Republicans, they said, we're not going to stick around. We're not going to wait this out to see what Lincoln's going to do. 7 citizens of 7 states decided to secede, and then after, of course, Lincoln called out the militia in response to Fort Sumter and the shelling of that federal fort. 4 other states, including the Commonwealth of Virginia, decided to join them. So it's absolutely imperative that people have a common story about who they are, a common identity, and in particular, I'll add, we're not like the vast majority of countries that are, if you will, I mean, their citizens are, in a way, as the Greeks put it, autochthonous. In other words, they just kind of sprouted from the ground, right? What makes you Japanese or Mexican or French in the olden days was because of blood, because of ancestry. This was a country, what made us in part new is because of what King famously called our creed. We're a creedal nation. And so understanding what that creed is and who's included, that's not optional for Americans. That is imperative.
You have to have a common narrative generally, but I think it's almost impossible to assume that there's going to be one narrative. There's never, in a family, there's not one narrative about what's going on in the family. There has to be negotiation. There have to be negotiations about what that is. It works better if there's a common, one common narrative, but I think it's always a negotiation. You're always going to be struggling over how to get the right balance. I agree with this, I don't agree with that. What kind of trade-offs can we have to appease one another or whatever? It's always going to be a negotiation between the two of them. It works better, but I'm trying to think of a nation where there's one understanding about who they are, just in general. There are always going to be points of contact, but you're right, of contrast, but you're right. If it gets too far out of whack, if the issue is too big, and slavery was one, and they were fighting about it from the very beginning. I mean, it almost didn't come together from the very beginning on this question. But they came to a compromise that eventually broke apart because it just got to be, I mean, with technology, the profitability of slavery, all of those things changed. And at some point, people in the North said, I don't want to be a part of a slave society. We don't want it to be a slave country. We wanted something different. We may have agreed that it could be where it was in the South. And the Southerners say, no, 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 this is an expansionist system. We can't just keep them in this place because there are going to be too many black people and the soil gets depleted and it's expansionist. We got to go to Texas. We got to go to Mexico. We got to go to Cuba. That was the goal. And the North said, we don't want a part of this. And so there's a point where it just began to break apart. But if you can agree on things, and it takes a time to do that, to come up with a way of developing society so that you have a general understanding about these are our values, these are the things that we hold dear, it works better. But you can't get, if you have one narrative, it's usually going to be because one group of people has shut down the other side. And it could bubble up and cause resentment, and at some point you end up with a revolution or conflict.
When you said you can't think of a country that has one narrative, it made me think that narratives are the backbone of political life, and that you can't really have a society that has political difference and can negotiate political difference without acknowledging that there are multiple narratives.
Well, but one thing, I was just talking, I had a class yesterday, and we were talking about the fact that there was a time when issues of race, like civil rights, The Civil Rights Act, for example, was a bipartisan thing. Republicans voted for that almost unanimously in the Senate to renew the Voting Rights Act and so forth. And then at some point, that changed. So even people who had different understandings about politics and considered themselves to be in different parties, there were some basic things that people agreed on. A notion of the rule of law, a notion of fairness and equality. I mean, how we achieve it was different, but you could have bipartisanship, and that's gone. So we've come to a point now where it's so fractured that it's very difficult to maneuver at this point. And this is not ancient history that you had that kind of bipartisanship. This is relatively, what we're doing now is different.
So there's an idea that there's a shared core narrative, and there might be different ways that the story is told, but there's a shared set of principles at the core of that narrative.
Yeah, a creedal nation, as he correctly says. I mean, the idea that there are certain beliefs that we hold. We're not on the same page about how we get there, but we do believe that America is an opportunity society. America is a society where people of all races and religions and so forth should be respected. But if there are people who don't believe that, all of a sudden come to the idea that, no, that's not who we are, that's a point of contention. It has become a point of contention.
Yeah, for me, the key debate, again, that led to what I'm calling an identity crisis in American history was when we no longer had a shared definition of what the Declaration called equality. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and the rest. That became redefined in my opinion. I'm clearly Lincolnian here, so I take Lincoln's position as the correct position. Southerners, in particular, white Southerners below the Mason-Dixon line, came to a point in time where they did not hold the founders' view of equality, at least as Lincoln understood it. The natural possession of the rights, that belonged to everyone, regardless of sex, race, color, etc. They came to a point where they had to redefine that and make it political equality or equality of states. And they loved the word equality, but they didn't, what they understood by it, and what Lincoln understood by it, and even what Stephen Douglas understood by it, these were different definitions. Once, I mean, good grief, if we can't agree on what equality is, forget about any other shared narrative, shared sense of values or principles. And so that's the key, I think, for us today, is how do we recover a shared understanding of what it means to be American? In other words, what are the components of our creed? I mean, yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, they very famously, I'm sure you know, the people cite the Cornerstone speech where
Alexander
Stevenson explicitly rejects the Declaration of Independence, repudiates Jefferson, and says,
Yes.
you know, they were wrong. The African race is not equal to the white race, and we can't act as if they are. And the cornerstone of our society is that is the great truth, and it justifies the system of slavery that they had in place. And so there was this breaking apart of an understanding about equality and what that meant. I wrote a book about Juneteenth and the end of slavery in Texas. And General Order Number 3 was promulgated or was announced by Gordon Granger when the Union Army gets to Texas and Galveston. And he says that at the end, the slavery was over and that African Americans now would exist in a state, and he uses the phrase absolute equality in the new society. Now, he could not pronounce that. Obviously, that's not what happened. But the very fact that he would do that, he was taking the creed, and he's linking to Lincoln, actually, from the Emancipation Proclamation and so forth. He's linking Lincoln and to Jefferson and equality. And so even here, even there in Galveston in 1865, what he was saying was that being an American believes in some notion of equality. And you're right, we do have to get back to this idea that is something that's of value, because it has been in part of the creed of the country from the very beginning.
You know, it seems that there's a tension between, we're thinking of, again, a founding document, the Declaration of Independence, that has principles that its principal author owned over 600 people over the course of his lifetime. Native Americans are referred to as merciless Indian savages. It was signed exclusively by wealthy white men, etc. Is the American narrative the tension between the principles and the lived experience?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big question. One thing we have to remember is this is a document that was issued in the midst of a war. The betting odds in Vegas, haha, at the time, was that we were not going to be successful in our bid for political independence, political separation from Great Britain. And the fact, I mean, the audacity of representatives of, quote unquote, the good people of these American colonies, as the Declaration puts it, the audacity of them to claim certain things, certain philosophical, chiefly Enlightenment principles to be self-evidently true, and thereby by those principles determined that the rule by Great Britain over Americans was unjust, and that we were just in securing our safety and happiness by altering or abolishing that kind of system. I mean, those things all could have been true and for naught at the end of the day if we weren't able to win ultimately on the battlefield. And so the context here is very, I think, important for us to remember. The Declaration of Independence is both axiomatic in the sense of laying out these principles, but those very principles are quite aspirational. And the way Lincoln put it, I'm sorry, you're going to get Lincoln one way or the other. Lincoln said they meant simply to declare the rights so that the enforcement of it might follow as fast as circumstances should permit. Those circumstances were, A, let's win this war. B, as a result of winning the war, then we can begin building the structures, at least federally, nationally, to secure these rights. What are those structures going to look like? What are the principles that are going to inform these structures, et cetera? So we were absolutely a work in progress. And one thing that I don't think is sufficiently appreciated these days, because it's hard, it's easy to play Monday morning quarterback, especially 250 years after the gig. But one thing that isn't sufficiently appreciated is the fact that, I mean, you mentioned religious, diversity. There was a tremendous amount of diversity on a number of fronts, and yet we were a nation that could not be a nation, a people, politically independent, without making certain compromises in establishing that union. In other words, we couldn't get everything done that we wanted to get done immediately. The old adage, half a loaf is better than nothing. And so, as I put it to my students, and of course this requires probably a whole other panel, is that essentially they decided for all practical purposes that they could not free themselves and free their slaves at the same time. That to try to do both would have failed on both counts. And therefore, securing independence was primary for their liberty. To secure that independence required unity, and to be unified, we had to make certain concessions, unfortunately, to the minority. And that minority was especially the slaveholding interests of South Carolina and Georgia.
Can you speak to this tension between the principles of the Declaration and the lived experience at the time of its writing? We had a reconciliation from Dr. Morel, but where do you see this tension? Is it part of the founding, and when we talk about the founding, this tension between the principles and the lived experience?
I thought you were asking
I'm asking.
Annette.
I'm asking you. Yes,
what Annette thinks on this is.
I'm asking for a response, essentially.
Oh, for a response. Well, the tensions are there because the Declaration was aspirational. And there was a statement that was really was basically designed to separate the American colonies from Great Britain, to announce to the world that they were among the powers of the earth and so forth, and we're going to be a new country. That's the basic diplomatic message, but we've taken it as a universal statement, and I think he intended it as a universal statement of human rights as a part of the sort of the notion of Enlightenment philosophy being influencing this particular document. But the aspiration creates the tension because there was a lived experience, as you said, of enslavement, of second-class status for other people. And many of the founders understood, including the principal author of the Declaration of Independence, that slavery was wrong. But there are many things that that people know are wrong. And for whatever reason, and in this case, the kind of compromise that you're talking about, there's nothing that he was going to do about it at that particular moment. And the rationalization, the thinking was, we have made this strike, this generation has made this strike for progress. Other generations, succeeding generations, will continue the march. And it can't all be done at once. And that's probably a realistic understanding, as much as we look back on that and say that, well, some people got started. They did in Massachusetts, and they did in Vermont and other places, but they also didn't have the connection to, the dependence on slavery that existed in the South. And so the interests who wanted to keep that in place were naturally going to fight for their rights. But the tension is always there. And the fact that there's a tension doesn't mean that the aspiration is wrong. I mean, it expresses something that's real. It's the nature of life. It's our own lives, our own individual lives, things that we want to achieve, things that we think are important, but for whatever reason, they're competing goals, competing loyalties, all of those kinds of things gum up the works. But the fact that there's a tension doesn't mean it was wrong. In fact, that is part of the American character. If I think of American identity and what it means to have a common story, it's the narrative of progress. America has been on a road, it's almost what we call Whiggish understanding about the nature of change. It gets better and better and better. That was certainly Jefferson's understanding about things. He's, the generations to come, he said on a number of occasions, will be wiser than we are, just as we are wiser than our forebears, that every generation would improve upon itself. And so when I think about the American identity and the understanding of American story, that's really a part of it, this notion of a nation, of a country that's on the move, is progressing and going forward. Very scientific understanding about the nature of life. I mean, looking at science, and these were people who were getting inoculation, getting all kinds of things that they saw as the advance of science, that applied to the life itself, and governments, that things would get better and better. Now, historians, we know that that's not true. We go forward and we go back, and sometimes 2 steps forward, 3 steps back, or whatever. And
you don't believe in the arc of the moral universe?
Yeah, yeah. We got to bend it, But we want to say that it's always going to get better and better, and that's, human beings do that in our own lives. That's, even if we really may not think that it's going to, but that's how we keep going forward. So I think the tension is a creative tension. It's a necessary tension.
Let me add something real quick. You mentioned how they abolished slavery in Massachusetts, for example. I think that that's a story that needs to be more widely known, because you mentioned lived experience. In 1776, again, we're only a year into the war. After the Declaration of Independence becomes public, Lemuel Haynes, a black man from Connecticut, I believe, writes, "Liberty Further Extended," a document we don't discover till many years later. What's the preface to this document, which argues, of course, that racial slavery is inconsistent with the Declaration? He quotes, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." The very year that document comes out, he's not waiting. His lived experience is, that declaration that I didn't write, the men who were in that building we now call Independence Hall don't look a thing like me. What they said is self-evidently true. It's manifestly true to me as well. And he makes this argument. 2 very famous cases in Massachusetts after they adopt a new constitution, again, in the middle of a war, 1780. John Adams has a strong hand in this. Quock Walker, black enslaved man, and Elizabeth Freeman, otherwise known as Mum Betts, they both sue. I mean, they're lowest on the totem pole, right? Enslaved people, they are suing, so-called freedom petitions. They're suing just for their own individual liberation, and their successful cases actually lead to the abolition of slavery in Massachusetts, according to the Massachusetts Constitution that has a version of the Declaration, right? All men are born free and equal. Doesn't have any racial component to it. And these enslaved people say, hey, I'm part of all men. This should apply to me. And Judge Cushing says, huh, did we really write that? I guess so. It means not only are you free, it's a series of cases, but not only are you free, but that means slavery itself. We're not talking just individual emancipation. Abolition takes place because of the efforts of people who are lowest on the political totem pole. So there's a lived experience that was fed into by a document that wasn't written by anybody who shared their experience, but were truths that they could readily identify with themselves. It's Lemuel Haynes' piece that I referred to, full of two things. Biblical principles, right, the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man, a very common trope among abolitionists, full of the Bible and full of Enlightenment political philosophy that was distilled in the Declaration of Independence. For me, there's nothing more quintessentially American than that. Bill Clinton put it in his first inaugural address. There's nothing wrong with America that cannot be cured by what is right with America. We never had to go abroad to figure out how to fix our problems. The solution was there from the jump.
And the people who were out, interestingly enough, the people, as you're saying, who were outside of that, I just finished an essay about Lemuel Haynes and African Americans who not only filed petitions, but did freedom petitions, but general petitions to the Massachusetts legislature, Prince Hall and other men who, some were freed and some of them were enslaved, citing the Declaration, again, as something that was meaningful. So whatever it meant in the way of separating from Great Britain, those words meant something to other people that were used. And there's a book by Hunter Spahn, who's a German historian, a German Jefferson scholar, that basically talks about how African Americans took the Declaration, have sort of made, we're the ones who sort of made it the creed by arguing, people who from the margins, arguing about what those words meant and saying that they applied to everybody over the years. And then African Americans took it up, women took it up. Every group that has tried to make a place for itself in American society has used the Declaration to do that. And so that's the creedal nature of the country comes through when people people actually do effectively use the words of the Declaration to change the law, to tamp down on discrimination, or to make a place for themselves in America. So that it's a messy process. It's not a matter of everybody agreeing about all aspects of it, but that is something core that we have, for the longest time, have sort of come to as a part of the American character, the American identity.
So we've been talking a lot about principles from the Declaration of Independence. We sort of moved to, well, what is the actual foundation of our political system? It's the U.S. Constitution. And of course, the Constitution embedded race directly into its structure. We made some references to this already, the 3/5 clause, protection of the slave trade till 1808, et cetera. Where does the Constitution fit? There are still people who are very dissatisfied with the Electoral College, for example, or other aspects of the Constitution. So and again, I'm going to jump ahead to another thing. We're talking about Reconstruction and the amendments that followed Reconstruction, 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. Can you speak to, Eric Foner calls that a second founding of the United States? I know that we've had a conversation, we might disagree with this. Can you speak to the Constitution and the fact that it is still our guiding document that was written from a racial perspective, including racial clauses in it? How can we reconcile that?
Well, I'll be a little more careful in describing the role of race in the Constitution, because obviously the Constitution itself does not refer to race at all. But I know what you're meaning by that are are the three principal compromises or concessions to the slaveholding interests, having to do with fugitive slaves, importation of slaves into the United States, and the representation of slaves in the House in terms of population towards representatives. But the fact that they studiously avoided the use of race and even the word slave. South Carolina wanted the word slave in the Constitution. If they were going to be part of the Union, they wanted it guaranteed that that institution that was chiefly a state institution could not be touched by Congress, at least in terms of its internal workings, what they called a domestic institution. And so they were very careful that when the country as a country, whether in interstate matters or dealing with foreign powers and Indian tribes and nations, in very few arenas could the nation as a whole address this particular domestic institution, namely slavery. But Madison, if we trust his notes, made sure that they would use the word persons and not slaves when they were referring to these concessions to the slaveholding interests. So I want to be very careful about that. I would not refer to these as racial clauses per se. Slavery, of course, as you guys know, doesn't make its appearance in the Constitution in a concrete way until we decide to get rid of it, which is the 13th Amendment. Now, in terms of, that's the long wind-up to, I hope is a shorter answer to your point about Foner referring, and others, referring to what we call the Reconstruction Amendments as a second founding. I don't like referring to those amendments as a second founding because by my earlier definition, the founding means something new, and I don't think that the regime became a different regime on the basis of those amendments. Those amendments put into play in a more structural way, in a more palpable and concrete way, the principles of the regime that were already there, the blessings of liberty, justice, a document that doesn't make reference to race, doesn't literally make reference to slavery. And so for me, the 13th, 14th, and 15th don't introduce something new in terms of regime principles, but they provide greater protections and bringing into fruition the principles that were there all along. So I hope somebody disagrees with me on that.
Okay, I might disagree with you on
Let's
that.
go.
All right, we got disagreement.
I think, I know what Eric means by that the founding, not in the sense of the structure of the government changed, although it does, because the 14th Amendment ends up not just being about race, it means about corporations. It made what happened during the Gilded Age possible, that there's a different world economically, and the structure of the government doesn't change, but a lot changes. It's fundamental that we live in the world that we live in, with the administrative state, all of those kinds of things come from the 14th Amendment, that's a part of it. So I think it's had effects that's more than just about liberty as we understand it, on a racial sense. Economically, it transformed America. Corporations are people. And, First Amendment rights, all kinds of things that have their genesis in interpretation of all of that. So I do see it as the founding of a country. A new country wasn't founded structurally or formally, but Black people voting, that's a big deal. The sort of repudiation of a notion of second-class citizenship, even though the Supreme Court kind of neutered the 14th Amendment in that regard. I kind of think it's founding in a metaphorical sense. It's not a real founding, an actual new country, but it's a different perspective, and it sort of changed African Americans' lives and expectations and so forth, and led to a lot of stuff that, by the time we get to the 60s, there's a real transformation of society. So it's if you look at the effects of the 14th Amendment in particular, because it's not just about race, it has a huge effect on the development of American life.
I'm glad you brought us up to the 60s because that's where I'd like to go
Okay.
now.
Major fast forward there.
Yeah, well, it's a little bit. I mean, no, unless you'd like to continue talking about Reconstruction amendments at
Go
all.
ahead.
Okay. I just, many scholars have made the claim that true democracy in America is roughly 60 years old because we tolerated discrimination in law in the South and elsewhere even since the end of Reconstruction. So in a framing, as you said, of what is new and better, the Civil Rights Acts of the 50s and 60s didn't just articulate principles, they mandated specific practices, voting rights, desegregation, fair housing. So I guess what I want to say is if we're thinking of Jefferson setting out on the road, we have the Constitution that's kind of steering us in directions and whatnot. When we get to the Civil Rights Act, is that the realization of the promise? And can we think of that as the founding of the true realization of the principles of the Declaration? I'm getting the sense we'll have disagreement on that, but
Well, I mean, not a founding, but certainly, well, King talked about it as a check coming into, to realize, on a promissory note that the Declaration offered. But you do, once you have the legal freedom of African Americans to vote, the Voting Rights Act, and after the 19th Amendment, women voting, all of the groups who had been excluded can participate since the 60s. So you do have, it's the first time that you have on paper an open, the Republic actually realizes the promise that was there at the founding with everybody together. So I wouldn't say that it's, again, not a real founding, but it's a huge change. It wasn't you can't talk about freedom in America when large numbers of people, my grandparents lived in a town where they had to be indoors before dark. When I went to school, when I went to movies with my brothers, when I was really young, we had to sit in the balcony. Went to waiting rooms, separate waiting rooms and this is the mid-60s that's going on here. This is taking place. So in a world where that kind of thing is happening with large numbers of people, we're not talking about a tiny group of folks, large number of people who are living behind a metaphorical iron curtain, you don't really have freedom. And after the 60s, I mean, there are all kinds of issues about voter suppression and all kinds of problems, but on paper, the legal regime, getting rid of de jure segregation, and commanding Voting Rights Act, I think, is an amazing transformation.
in many ways, the Civil Rights Act is a corrective, but it's not a repudiation of the principles themselves, and even those that are encoded in the Constitution. How do you? I know your work with Ellison has gotten us close to this era. How do you interpret where daily life and living with racism, to be frank, it seems only fair to imagine that would affect people's understanding of the virtues and values of America and taking us all the way back to its founding. I'm curious how you reconcile this with your understanding that the principles themselves hold and have held for 250 years.
I guess the way I would answer that question is we mark progress not necessarily as this ineluctable thing, right, which you call the Whig or Whiggish view of history, that it's just always onward and upward, but that we in America know we've made progress. I believe there is some consensus that we've made progress when the gap between profession and practice has narrowed. Okay? Ralph Ellison, another area of interest of mine, most famously wrote this novel, of course, Invisible Man in 1952. He had a novel that he was working on that his literary executor, John Callahan, published posthumously at the request of Fanny Ellison, Ralph's widow. It was the shorter one. It's called Juneteenth. That's not Ellison's title. That's Callahan's. And then it was the unexpurgated version. It was called 3 Days Before the Shooting. He has a black preacher watching a senator whom he raised in the South, but it's a kid who could pass for white, and eventually, of all things, only Ellison could pull this off, becomes a race-baiting senator from New England. But he's watching this senator talk, and he says to some of the congregants that are with him, he says, he's got them caught between what they profess to believe and what they feel they can't do without. So profession and practice, it's that gap that Ellison was calling attention to, and that we mark our progress when that gap is narrowed. The Civil Rights Act of '64 which had a voting rights provision in it, but it didn't have much teeth, and therefore a year later, they had to pass the Voting Rights Act of 1965. For me, those statutes were bringing into fruition, or the full flowering of the principles that were laid out in 1776. These were not new principles. The principles that informed the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, the principle that informed the 19th that gave women the right to vote at the national level. These were not new discoveries in terms of principles, but as I see it, the full flowering of the seeds that were planted way back in 1776. Now, two things complicate the narrative as I lay it out. One that we haven't talked a lot about is the federal nature of the United States, right? So what we think as a nation on the one hand, and what we think at the state level, states qua states. And the fact of the matter is, for the vast majority of American history, most of the power, what the lawyers call the police powers, right, the power to promote the safety, health, welfare, and morals of the community, Congress doesn't get that authority. That's closer to home. That stays at the state and local level, okay? So the difficulty is, after the Civil War, to what extent do we want the national government making decisions we usually leave for the states? And of course, the reason why you would want the national government to do more of that is precisely because certain of these states no longer considered themselves part of America. You have the vast majority of black Americans living among former oppressors. They're going to need a federal army to guarantee their right to vote, to guarantee many of their rights, to sue in a court of law, etc. Of course, those protections went by the wayside when majority white America, generally speaking, didn't want to pay for that anymore, and was unfortunately expedited by a Supreme Court that, in a matter of a few decades, before the turn of the century, essentially gut the meanings, the principal meanings of the 14th Amendment, due process and equal protection clause. And so what we find in the 20th century, the long civil rights movement, as I consider it, is a nation that's trying to regain its footing on the original principles, but running into these state impediments. These are signaled, I mean, the signal achievements, certainly according to Ralph Ellison, the first really big one is the Brown v. Board of Education decision. Unanimous 9-0 decision by the Supreme Court in May of 1954. But how does the Commonwealth of Virginia, where I currently live, how did they respond? They responded with mass resistance, right? Massive resistance. And so you have a federal action, unanimous court, written in plain English, very short Supreme Court case, to try to grease the skids on its reception in the South. And of course, how fast did it happen? In the famous words of Thurgood Marshall, when he interpreted, what does all deliberate speed mean? He said, I'll tell you what it means. It means S, L, O, give me one more, W. That's what it means. And so even this unanimous federal decision took many years to become a reality, followed up by the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act. But then again, you have the Supreme Court stepping in to decide, well, how are we going to implement these things? You have the introduction of affirmative action under a Republican administration, Nixon, right? I know JFK and LBJ had their version of it, to be sure, but it really began with Nixon and then became a much bigger deal nationwide. So how does that policy jibe with the original principles? And so this is, you mentioned earlier, having to negotiate or navigate this and compromise and work through this over time. This is like a follow the bouncing ball kind of thing right now. And so we still haven't settled on what the meaning, I mean, like who talks about equality these days? We don't talk about equality these days. We talk about equity. So is equity equality? Apparently not. Equity means something different. And there's certainly no consensus about what equity means, besides the real strict legal definition of equity. So all of this to say that this is an ongoing conversation that Americans are having, will have with their governors, their rulers, their representatives, etc. All three branches of government are definitely going to have their say and have been having their say throughout our American history.
Well, that's what it means to be involved in an experiment, calling it the American experiment. How do you know, what is this all about? How do we make all of this work, all these moving parts? You have a system, an economic system that was racially based, that helped create or cement a racial hierarchy, understandings that taught whites how to view blacks, taught how blacks how to view whites, and all of these things they don't disappear. You don't have a couple hundred years of that and have it, and then the aftermath with Jim Crow, to have all of that disappear overnight. So we are in a, the tension that you referred to before, a constant negotiation between culture, the culture that was created, the laws. Laws are aspirational. Laws are on the books, but there's real life every day that sometimes people apply. Sometimes people comply with it, and sometimes they don't. Sometimes people agree with, and sometimes they don't. It's a constant negotiation. But I think you have to see it for what it is. That it's a journey that we've been on, and I think that's very much a part of the American story. Seeing ourselves as being in an experiment that's an ongoing one, trial and error, backwards and forwards, and going ahead as best we can.
Thank you for that. We're gonna open up for questions very soon here. I want to just bring us right up to the present. And you said something about progress and feeling like we have made we can see progress over the course of 250 years and all of the various institutional changes that we've been talking about. We've also seen in recent years language and acts that many thought belonged to an earlier era re-enter the public sphere. We've seen elements of the Civil Rights Act be taken down. We've seen, sometimes from the highest places of our country, we've heard language that is shocking. I just want to know, for many people of color facing daily indignities, their lived experience might suggest that whatever the answer to tonight's question is about race and the founding of America, that racism feels fundamental to some folks in the lived experience of being in America. How do we, in today's climate, address this in a way that can keep the idea that national narratives are still important, that national narratives can welcome in people of all colors, all genders, all expression? I guess I'd like you to just sort of give us some advice from your perspective on how we can be as measured as we are on this stage in a public sphere that is frankly not measured at all and is full of some shocking content.
That's a rough one.
I'm sorry to throw that out, but I feel
well,
like
think
we're living in the world here today, folks.
I'll let Annette have the last word, so I'll begin with the first word. This is the 250th anniversary of the birth of the United States, if you mark our birth with the publication of the Declaration of Independence, July 4th, 1776. The official word is semi-quincentennial. What better time or what better moment than the present, than this year? It's only February, it's still February, got a lot of months left. What better time than to have conversations about what it means to be American? What is the meaning of America? What was born on July 4th, 1776? Yes, it took a war. Yes, it took a treaty. Yes, it took a constitution to fully instantiate the thing, or at least get the machine moving. But the principles were announced on July 4th. I think what better time than the present to look back at those principles and talk about them, and actually mouth those words and ask ourselves, what does it mean that a truth is self-evident? What does it mean that a particular people hold these truths to be self-evident? What does the word men in all men are created mean? What does equality mean? What are rights? What is consent? How do these things all hold together? Why is there this right of revolution that isn't a political or constitutional thing, but a natural thing? what elements of the Bible are in the Declaration, what elements of Enlightenment political philosophy are in there. How do we parse this thing that in some form or fashion, the movers and shakers of the long history of the civil rights movement that is American history have always turned to what King called this promissory note, right? The Declaration and the Constitution. I think we need to start there, and I trust if we start there, and if we are measured. Annette and I are actually going to have an arm wrestling match when we're done. But if we are measured in thinking through and parsing that document and others of that period to try to get at the meaning, I think, I trust and have faith that we can recover a consensus about what equality means, what that rights inherent in an individual are, why government by the consent of the governed is only the only legitimate way to rule a people. I mean, because if we can't agree on those things, then I don't see how we can move forward.
I think you're right. We have to have that conversation. I may be a little less hopeful than you are on the outcome of all of that, because we're in a moment that I just never anticipated where we would be. I mean, where we are sort of moving, some people are moving away from the notion of the declaration of us as a creedal nation. In fact, I mean, have said blatantly that we're not. That's not what it is. It's not about ideals. It's more akin to blood and soil conception of what it means to be an American, which is, you know, for a nation of people who are from all over the world and have been from the very beginning is, you know, crazy. I mean, it really, you can't. I just don't see how we can continue with that, suggesting that there are certain Americans who are, who belong here and Americans who don't. Now, everybody, there have been people who believe that from the very, very beginning, but that's been a smaller group of folks, and it wasn't tied to any particular political party. Both, it was a bipartisan understanding. I mean, I'm not, I wasn't I will admit, the greatest fan of his, but I mean, Ronald Reagan talked about America as a nation of immigrants and how important it was for people that you could come to, he said, you can't go to France and be French. You can't go to Germany and become a German or whatever, but you can come to America and become an American essentially because of our documents and because of what we have. If you believe these things and, you pass the test, I suppose, then you can become an American. And that's an amazing thing, that we always held that out as something that was supposed to be good about us, and that this is what made us different from other places, that we could be welcoming to other people and take the talents and the devotion that people bring to the country and make it better. I don't know that, I mean, we don't seem to be there anymore. And so I think you're right. You're 100% right that we should remind people of this and have this conversation. I don't know that everybody, as many people that need to, are going to be available to hear that right now. We're in an interesting moment, and I don't quite know how to parse that.
Well, I hope that maybe some of our audience members will help us think about other ways to do that. First of all, thank you.
So we get to ask them the
Yes, we're going to
questions.
ask them all kinds of questions. Thank you
I'm a
both for
law
such a
professor,
wonderful
cold called.
Let me just say a few things about our question and answers. I think we'll start with one or two Zoom questions to give you folks in the audience a time to think a little bit about it. I'm going to ask for if we can keep our responses relatively short so we can get to as many. And I just want to remind folks who come to a microphone or in this room to please make the framing of your question very brief. And consider using an interrogative like who, what, when, where, why, because those are great ways to ask questions. So we'll start with a question from Zoom, and then we'll go right to the audience. Are we ready for that, Nora, or would you like to start in the audience?
Why don't we start with the audience?
Why don't we start with the audience, because there might not be anybody. Okay. We have a question all the way over here. Or, Nora, if you want to call him, it's bright.
I think Derek's got it.
Someone's coming. All right, we got you.
Hi, my name's Shiva. I'm a public policy sociology student. and Agora fellow here. I'm curious about the role of class in this narrative and how it has changed over time. I think one of the things, you know, you talked about how like America, some scholars describe America not as a democracy until like the last 60 years. Some people also talk about the South in particular as, you know, an enclave of feudalism until the end of Jim Crow, and could describe both the Civil War and the Civil Rights Movement as sort of a bourgeois revolution in the South. And this is super Marxist, but I guess my question as today, you know, it seems that a small group of very rich people call the shots in this country. How does that relate to the founding story and its intersection with race? And is there a way to separate those two, or yeah, what can we learn from that?
Thank you for that. Who would like to take that question on? Class in this discussion.
Only in America could Lincoln be possible. Lincoln, in terms of class, had a hard scrabble existence growing up, hated working on the farm, hated being rented out by his father, and as soon as it was legal for him to leave his family, he left the farm behind and was able in this country, in more or less a frontier state like Illinois, to figure out what he was good at. Never went to law school. His rival Stephen Douglas didn't go to law school. You didn't have to go to law school to become an attorney. And so Lincoln certainly thought that the principles of the regime and the structures, more or less, allowed for somebody to improve his lot in life if he was more or less a hard worker and industrious. And so I guess I don't buy the narrative that we're dominated, at least on a day-to-day level, by a certain bourgeois, a certain minority of powerful elites that make it impossible for a child of immigrants. My folks are from the Dominican Republic. You know, they came over to New York in 1962. My sister was born in 63. I was born a year later. Growing up, we were taught, you know, watch Zoom, Sesame Street, and do your homework. And they also wanted to know who I was hanging out with. But essentially, you know, the world would be your oyster if you got those things right, okay? So a country where a guy like Lincoln, who didn't go to school for more than 12 months total in his life, a country where an escaped slave like Frederick Douglass could build a future for himself, once, of course, British friends manumitted him by paying 150 pounds sterling. That I guess this is my argument for, are we going to be in a situation where privileged rich folks will always have advantages over non-privileged poor folks? Yeah, that's a question that answers itself. But I don't care how rich Musk or Bezos or Soros or Gates. I don't mind them making their fortunes as long as their decisions don't impinge on me taking advantage of the opportunities that are available. And so what would be plan B that would provide for a greater way for the bottom quintile to get higher into a higher quintile? I haven't seen a better solution to what we've got.
The way it plays, the way class is played in the United States is to sort of downplay it. In fact, race is predominated over class, and it's a cliche that in the South, race was used to dampen class antagonism. Poorer whites were taught to identify with the planter class, or richer whites, you know, on the basis of race, instead of realizing that, I live in a shotgun shack, that the black person's living in a shotgun shack, and we have more in common than I do with the person living in the house with the pillars. But because you're white, you are on the side of the person with the big house with the pillars. And the South has been willing to remain behind in order to maintain that racial hierarchy by tamping down on the notion of class. And so that's been a way of keeping down class antagonism and keeping, an alliance from people who are poor or middle class, and even from alliance with one another who share their interests. And so race has played a role that it didn't. People in Europe, I did a language study program when I was in college, and it really impressed me that my brothers and sisters in France, they thought of themselves as being part of a class. Class was important to them, and it determined how they voted, how they thought about politics and so forth, in a way that it doesn't here. So I think race, this is a long way of saying race kind of obscures class. I do care how much money they have if they don't pay taxes. I don't begrudge them, but there may be so many billionaires may be evidence of a kind of imbalance in the system, and too much of a concentration of wealth. And then Citizens United, where the Supreme Court says that money is speech, so that people who have more money than God can buy political favor and sort of make the government in their shape. I think it warps a republic to have that. I don't begrudge people being rich, but there's a certain point at which, if you're not paying taxes, and if you have an outsized influence by money, not just by voting and making your feelings known the way we can all do, but by money in ways that I'm sure if you brought the founders back here, they'd be very, very old, but if you brought them back and said, and showed that people were giving donations to people who then voted the way they wanted, they would think that was bribery. They would have a completely different understanding about what is speech today. So that, I don't begrudge people being successful, but the not paying taxes and having an outsized influence on politics, that bothers me.
It seems there's always this tension between freedom and money, and the equation of my money
Yeah.
is my freedom. I think if you're having a multicultural democracy, it might be something that if we could get people to accept, we might have some laws that'll change your favored tax bracket or whatever, and if we accept that, that could change again in another vote, and we just accept that. But I think ideologically, we use language that prevents that. Enough of me, more of you folks. So I see questions all around here. And then we'll get over to this side over here.
Who has the mic?
Who has the mic? There we go. Okay. Question.
Stand up so you can see me. So this question is going to be about what would you tell students about this, about seeking out hidden figures like Mumbet and Kwok Walker, who use the law to put themselves as part of American democracy. As far as race is concerned, in North Carolina, Black and Indigenous and free people of color were living here right in Orange County, all the way up through Virginia for over 100 years in 1776. And there is a plethora, treasure trove of information right in Wilson Library about them, about us, but there is not anything going on in the America 250 narrative. So what would you tell students, especially, and members of the public, about seeking out those hidden figures, because everybody can't necessarily be a major historian?
Mm-hmm. Well, historical societies are great sources of information. The Gilder Lehrman Institute has a website that's a wonderful resource for young people, for research, for classes, all kinds of things. I don't just Google Gilder Lehrman Institute, LEHRMANGILDER. Wonderful site that has lots of primary documents. They live on the notion of primary documents. And I would tell them to start there. That's a good place to go. And then there are local historical societies where you can get the kind of information that you're talking about that tell you about the area and the people who were free in those particular places. But those are places I would go.
Real quickly, since I'm on the Federal Commission, what we have done is approach this in a very decentralized way. So we have strongly encouraged all the states to set up their own 250 commissions and the territories, and we have liaisons to Indian tribes and nations. And so we have been trying to get the people who are closest to the people within each state to raise money and put on programs, et cetera. Gilder Lehrman is one source. There are a number of electronic or digital sources for teachers to draw from. More and more, New York Times had a long article on this sometime last year that talked about how teachers don't want partisan stuff. They want to stay away from anything that looks like it's a conservative or liberal or whatever, however you want to divide it up. They just want the latest reliable scholarship, and so they're moving away from textbooks, in fact. They say that in history, right, it's the winners who write the history. Well, in the case of the Civil War, it was actually the losers for the longest time who wrote the history, the so-called Dunning School. But be that as it may, in today's world, the teachers don't mind stuff that's free. That's great. And folks like Gilder Lehrman and a number of other institutions put on programs, give teachers stipends and resources, especially over the summer, to bone up on history, to remind them why they got into the field to begin with. So there's just a ton. Like if you were in Massachusetts and you don't know who Quack Walker and Elizabeth Freeman is, that is a travesty. So that one for me is an easy one. Local historical societies, the state commission, you should just say, hey, what's up with this? Why don't you guys sponsor something, put on some programming to tell this story and direct, especially teachers, because that's the gift that keeps giving. I mean, K through 12, once they know it, every generation of students that passes through is going to know that story as well. So for me, we just have to tell a more capacious story about who we are and how we came to be over time. It's about true inclusion. It's not bring in some to the exclusion of others, bring in some at the expense of others. It's no, tell the history right. I'll just say one more thing. The guy who invented what we now call Black History Month, Carter G. Woodson, it began as Negro History Week, then it became a whole month. He says it's not about creating Negro history, to use the locution. It's about the Negro in history. And he considered what we call a Black History Month as essentially a public service announcement to both whites and blacks and everybody in between in this country. It's making it plain and recording all the voices that were major movers and shakers in terms of our, again, progress as a nation.
And public libraries.
And if I could give you a very specific tip, humanities.unc.edu, the webpage for Carolina Public Humanities, our subsidiary, Carolina K-12, has thousands of pieces of information for teachers, lesson plans, curriculum, a whole series of what we call hidden histories, where you'll learn about Abraham Galloway and all sorts of folks that don't make it into the history books. So that's right here in Carolina, resources that we do with teachers all the time. We'll be bringing hundreds of teachers this summer to workshops to talk about these very topics. So that's here at home. Actually, I think we do have a question. I think Nora had a question from our Zoom audience, and then we'll make sure. We're at the point where we're running low on time, so let's make our questions snappy, and we'll get the
yes,
answers.
no, and maybe.
So let's get the question from Zoom, and then we'll come around and get as many as we can.
In the process of creating our founding story, standardizing it, do we risk forgetting people's stories, histories? For instance, how often do we tell the story of founding without Indigenous people?
Indigenous people are all over the founding. There's so many books, Kathleen Duvall. I mean, that is the burgeoning history right now. So, I mean, I think the latest, I haven't seen it. I was in it, but I haven't seen it. The documentary on the American Revolution starts with Native American, Indigenous people. So that's the hot field right now.
Both of my colleagues' books, Independence Lost and Native Nations by Kathleen Duvall, are absolutely essential pieces for incorporating especially Native voices into the story.
so energetic back there.
I know
you.
this person.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah. I have a question about how you two would place the rise of racialized or perhaps racist politics today into the arc of American history. Do you think that it's a reaction to a temporary moment of socioeconomic circumstances, or do you think that it is the product of something that is deeper and more intrinsic to our American identity and history?
It's something that's intrinsic to American history. I mean, we've always had this battle about what, where the racial part of it. We always had this battle about where people of color fit in the American narrative. And we're coming off a period where we had the first African American president and changes socially, culturally, in attitudes towards women. Lots of cultural changes that I think have produced sort of a backlash against that. There's a wonderful book by Timothy E., and I've forgotten the name of it, but it's about Indiana in the 1920s when the state was basically taken over by the Klan. And the impetus, the reason was, number one, the changing attitudes towards women. Women got the vote, lots of immigration, lots of black migration into Indiana, and there was a reaction against that. So I think we're in a period of reaction against a lot of the cultural changes that took place in the last 20 years or so. So this has always been there. It's not like these are new sentiments, but I think it's reaction. And so it goes forward and back, and we're in this battle, negotiation, and this is a part of that.
Just a quick addendum is social media makes it a more pronounced reality than would otherwise have been the case, say, 25 years ago or when I was growing up. So if it had already been there, it was, guys huddled up somewhere. Now they're broadcasting their stuff out loud. But truth be told, I mean, for me, I want to know who my enemies are. I'd rather them be out in the open than hidden. And so I'm hoping it's not an accurate barometer of where the country is, that let's just say that these are a few mice that are roaring. That's my hope. Maybe I'm just the eternal optimist here.
Great. And again, let's try to get our questions framed very quickly, and so we can get to as many of them as we can. And Professor Hannigan is coming around. Someone, there we go.
Good evening. Thank you for being here. Like we've just mentioned, we've heard a lot of varying levels of optimism in the talk this evening. My question is, what do you view as the biggest existential threat to living up to the spirit of the principles embodied in the Declaration by the founders? Is it free speech? Is it polarization? Is it current executive orders? I'm curious to know. Thank you.
Greatest threat.
For me, greatest threat, I'll say it's a great threat. I don't know how to measure these things, but we need to redouble our efforts to protect freedom of speech, which means we have to accept we're going to hear things we don't like, things that may trigger us, offend us. That's how we ferret out or vet the opinions that are out there and figure out the way forward. I am not interested at all in moving the needle on greater government control over how people say what they say. I think the whole point of free speech is to persuade, and the last thing I need is the people who are in power telling me what I can say about the people who are in power, okay? So if you want to give voice to the voiceless, the last thing you want to do right now is give a small group of people the authority to say which speech is allowed to be uttered. So for me, we've got to redouble our efforts to protect free speech, and that means on college campuses, first and foremost, in my opinion.
The greatest threat to me is the disintegration of the tripartite system of government, where Congress doesn't play its role, where the Supreme Court doesn't play its role, where those entities become so partisan, the court becomes so partisan that it renders decisions based upon party politics. And the Congress not doing what it's supposed to do. I mean, basically handing the gavel over to the president. I mean, they're supposed to be, the notion of the founders was that, well, Article 1, Congress, as the representatives of the people, would play a role, would check. They would check one another, and certainly Congress would check a president. The notion of the unitary executive of an imperial president is, to my mind, the biggest threat that we have today. And I would like to see Congress jealously guard its powers, the power to tariff, the power to go to war, all those kinds of things. And that was the idea, that these three branches would each play a role, and not one would predominate over the other. But certainly we didn't get rid of George III to create another version of George III here. So that's the big threat to me, the dysfunction of the American government.
Yeah, Congress used to think of itself as a team in playing a game with the president and the judiciary, and there might be differences on the team, but they were a crew.
Even if they were, you had a Congress of the same party with the president. They said, no, you can't do that, or this is our prerogative. We might go along with you, but you have to come to us first. But by saying preemptively, you don't even have to do that, then what is the government for if they're not playing that role, the three-party tripartite government?
All right, we're in the lightning round, folks. We see a hand up in the back in the middle there, and there's so many hands up, so I'm going to let our microphone walkers decide who gets the.
Do you want to? Why don't we take a few in a row?
Yeah, that's a good idea. Why don't we take a few questions in a row? So if you could make your question short, we'll try to add it to the stack.
Sure. So I think it was established at the beginning that during the founding of America that slavery was sort of a necessary sacrifice to uphold the principles of the nation. So do you think that a racist today is still an accurate candidate to hold up the principles, and if not, where that line was drawn in history?
No.
Can you rephrase that last little part, because I'm not sure I caught that last part.
Sure. So if slavery was necessary to uphold the principles of America during the founding, do you think that a racist or a bigot could uphold those same principles today, or do you think that somewhere in history our definition of equality sort of got changed in order to not allow that anymore?
Could we have slavery again?
Sure, it's possible. I mean, look at
No, I mean, is that what you're asking?
No.
If slavery was necessary, then I see if I can rephrase it. If slavery was necessary, then are we still in a place where we can figure out a way to equality? We made a concession to slavery in our founding documents. Can we make a concession to racism today?
Sure, that sounds right.
Yeah, I think American history, the 1850s bears this out. I don't think that a rock-ribbed, categorical white supremacist, I'll be specific, could make an appeal today and be successful nationally. I'm old, and so I know who a guy named David Duke is. He could be successful at the local level, but he could never become a U.S. senator. He could never become a president of the United States. And, this is part of your question, I don't think a racist could become a president of the United States and claim that he is an upholder of the principles of the Declaration of Independence. He would either have to do what Alexander Stephens did in 1861 and say, Lincoln's understanding of the founders, it is an accurate understanding of the founders, and they were wrong, okay? He would either have to reject the principles of the founding, or he would have to reinterpret them and define equality, define rights, define consent in a way that was inconsistent even with the slaveholder Jefferson. So if that's what your question is it possible for a racist to become American president and say, I've got the Declaration tattooed on my back? I don't think that's possible.
Okay. Yeah, we'll try to keep the answers until we get both the questions.
Oh, sorry.
Okay, great. Thank you, Nora.
Thank you both for your talk. I just wanted to ask briefly, you both mentioned God and how the founders were at the very least deists. I just wanted to ask if you think that the constitutional ideals are able to persist when, I guess, Christianity and the thought of religion in general seems to be not dwindling, but greater minority than it used to be.
And another
It's-
question.
Oh, thank you. Are reparations needed to keep closing the gap between profession and practice?
Can you read?
Are reparations,
How are reparations?
are they needed to keep closing the gap between profession and practice?
Okay. So we have questions about religion and Christianity and questions about reparations.
I'll do the religion one first. It's manifest that the Declaration of Independence has a what I would call a natural theology that undergirds it. There are 4 references to God in the Declaration of Independence, but they're not sectarian references. They're not denominational. They don't say Jesus Christ is Lord. They don't get into those denominational or religious differences. And so if you remove that, I forget the person who asked that question, if you remove this understanding that our rights, our rights or human rights are rights that are endowed by a creator, I think you have a more difficult time establishing a self-evident basis for the notion of human dignity. That's the word we would prefer to use today. But this idea of the imago Dei, that all human beings are made in the image of God, if you get rid of that, if you get rid of at least this natural theology that undergirds the Declaration, I think it becomes highly problematic to try to justify this understanding and gain a consensus that there are things that all human beings possess by virtue of the fact that they're human, simply human, without thinking of them as part of a created order.
Would you like to take on reparations in the context of this conversation?
Well, reparations of some form.
With your microphone. There you go. No worries.
Reparations in some form are necessary, and there's an argument about what that could be, whether you start with slavery, whether you start with Jim Crow. I mean, people who are alive, who had things happen to them that, that violated the law. I mean, slavery was legal at the time, but then after this, in the aftermath of the 14th Amendment and the Reconstruction Amendment, there were lots of things that went on that were against the law, and people should be able to find. I mean, they tried that down in Oklahoma and didn't work, but I think morally that is something that is required. On the Declaration and religion, there's a natural religion that's involved in it, but it's a deist. It's not a one that's based on Christianity. You talked about Christianity, but I mean, the person who authored those words considered himself to be a Christian, but he didn't think that Jesus was divine. And, he wrote his own Bible, took out the parts of the Bible that he thought were miracles and were therefore things that were made up that Jesus never said, and that he was just a man. He was a good man, but was not a divine. So it was not, Christianity wasn't necessary, but he did believe in a creator, something that made people and made the world, but made the world and then just kind of stood back.
Washington would beg to differ.
Well, that'll have to be the subject of our next debate. I want to thank Professors Gordon-Reed and Morel for their incredible engagement with us. Certainly, we want to thank the Program for Public Discourse, Dean Atkins, Nora Hannigan, and everybody who was responsible for putting this together, and the great folks that did the tech and everything. Thank you all for that. And, of course, we want to thank you, the audience, for caring enough about this topic to be here tonight and to engage in this conversation. And to reward you, there is pizza out there waiting for you. Yeah, can you believe it? Thank you again. This has been an absolute delight. Please follow the Program for Public Discourse, Carolina Public Humanities as well, and we'll see you next time. Thank you. Bye-bye.